on vulnerability. I wanted to share a bit about vulnerability today because it's a topic that, is pretty conscious for everybody these days. Most people have an awareness of vulnerability and its importance in relationship. This is partly thanks to the incredible Brené Brown, who has brought a lot of this to our attention. She does amazing work. If you haven't heard of her, then please go and check her out. I really like to take it to another place when working with people around in relationships, because it's one thing to have an awareness around vulnerability. So we all know we need to be vulnerable. Okay, we all know that in order to be able to be intimate with someone, we need to be vulnerable, because if we're protecting ourselves all the time, then the other person's never going to get to see the intimate, to see who we really are. And why is that important? Well, because a lot of people that I work with feel like, and myself included, just people in general, we feel like we're not really being seen, or, we might feel like if we're in a relationship or dating, but we don't really get that deep connection with somebody. We don't really feel that full soul level kind of connection, or we feel like, we just don't feel super duper loved, or just that juicy feeling. We don't get that. And more often than not, this is to do with not being vulnerable. And the reason that that is, obviously, what vulnerable means is that you're open and that your inner self is being seen and heard and felt. And I love this. I can't remember where I heard this. It might have been from Jeremiah Abrams, who's a good friend of mine. Beautiful, beautiful man. Anyway, the actual translation of vulnerability is willing to be wounded. So, to be vulnerable literally means to be open enough and sharing enough of your true self that you're willing to be wounded. You don't want to be wounded, but you are willing to be, because to be vulnerable means that you have to be willing to be wounded. Anyway, getting more to the point, vulnerability is different for everybody. So when I first start working with people, often, especially in the groups, we talk about vulnerability and they say, well, how do I be vulnerable? And there's no real answer to that. There's no general answer to that. And this is one of the challenges I find with people who are trying to be vulnerable, or who bring vulnerability into their life, or consciously trying to bring it into their life more, is that people don't really know what vulnerability means, and or how to be vulnerable. And the reason for this is that vulnerability is different for everybody. What makes me vulnerable may not make you vulnerable. What makes you feel open and exposed is different to what the next person does. There's one thing, though, that I see. There's a commonality amongst women, especially. So I can see that there's some people watching, but I can't see who you are, so I'm sorry, but hello. My phone sometimes does that. I'm on my phone, not my computer. Yeah, there's one commonality that I see amongst women when they're in relationship or dating, in vulnerability, and that is something that I call the gap. And that is the place between feeling and desire and action. So, all the women that I work with have the desire to be held by a man, to be able to be in a relationship with a man who takes care, who considers them, who embodies all of the masculine traits that we enjoy and that we like, where he takes charge, he makes things happen, he can withstand your emotional distress and be present still and love you and hold you, and all of those things. That's what we want. And so often we find ourselves in situations where the men fall short of that. And one of the big reasons for that is our inability to be vulnerable with them, specifically when it comes to what I call the gap. So this is a bit of content from my work that's actually really, really valuable. So if you're wanting to know a bit more about how to do this is really important. When we want something from a man, so if we want him to ask us on a date, or we want him to take care of our feelings, we want to share something with him, we need to leave a space for him to do that, and we very, very rarely do. And the reason for that is we're scared. We're scared that he's not going to step up. We're scared that he, and this comes from past experiences with previous men, and right all the way back, it comes usually from familial patterning, so being in families where our needs weren't met. And so because we're so used to our needs not being met from an early age, we don't leave space for a man to do so, because we're afraid that he's not going to step up. And if he doesn't step up, either we're going to be in a relationship or a situation where we know we shouldn't be because it's not good for us, or we have to lie to ourselves to stay in the relationship, and so we usually avoid it. However, what I find with the women that I work with is that when we do leave the gap for a man to actually take action and respond, more often than not, and look, if I were to put a figure on it, I would say 98% of the time, men will step up, even the kind of men who normally don't. Because men are human beings, and men in their masculine trait especially, they're human beings who want to help. And men generally want to be in their masculine polarity with a woman. And that means taking care, that means taking action, that means stepping up and being the hero. And so when we can leave that gap, and I want to give you a real example. One of my clients, who is an incredibly beautiful and powerful woman in her own right, and she recently was dating a man who, with whom she was wanting to know where it was going to go. She wanted to know where the relationship was going to go. And she pushed a little bit more than he was ready for, and really more than she was ready for too, but she pushed a little bit and he pulled back. Now, when he pulled back, she wanted him to step forward. She wanted him to take care and to be more present. But we realized that what had been happening was she was constantly asking him or telling him when she was going to be free and what she was doing and when she had time to see him and how it was going to look. Now, the reason she was doing that is because she's a really busy woman and she wanted to make sure that she had time in her life for relationship. But upon deeper reflection, the real reason she was doing this is because she didn't trust that he would. She didn't trust that he was going to step forward. So anyway, we worked through this a little bit, and she's had to step into her vulnerability by not saying what she wants all the time, or not saying what she wants, but not making it happen, not making the dates, not making the phone calls, not being the one to text. And in that moment, she's in that little gap, that space. Now, that gap might last a minute, it might last a day, it might last a week, whatever it needs to be for you to feel vulnerable. In that little gap of time, all those feelings that she's been avoiding come up. Fear of rejection, fear of not being good enough, it's never going to work for me, I'm too busy, men don't step up, men don't take care of me, I attract the wrong kind of men. All of those feelings come to the surface. Now, the more open you are to feeling those feelings, the more willing you are to be wounded or vulnerable, the more quickly they move through. And what happened to her is immediately he stepped forward. And he was even able to articulate that actually, he realizes he wanted to feel like he was, he was directing more, and he wanted to take charge, and he really wants to see her and do things with her. And now he has the capacity to do that, and he's stepping forward. But the best thing is she's had the experience of being met. So in the past, she would have just left when this happened, walked away and said, well, he's, pulling back, I don't have the time for this. Or she would have just kept on, trying to make things happen and felt like she just wasn't being met on that deep, deep level. Anyway, so having that experience of the gap, of letting yourself be vulnerable. Now, and the gap can happen also in moments where even just speaking. So, let's say someone there's a guy who's supposed to pick you up and he comes late, and how do we express ourselves in that moment? You need to remember to let there be a gap, let there be an opportunity for him to step forward and take responsibility. So if he's late, if my husband picked me up late and he said nothing, I'd be upset. So I'd let myself feel upset. Would I express that I'm upset? Not necessarily. Maybe I would, maybe I wouldn't, but I just feel my upsetness, and leave that. And then if he asks why I'm upset, I might say something like, yeah, well, I'm really upset that you were late. And say nothing else. Just leave it. That's the gap. In that gap, he has the opportunity to say sorry or to not, or to say, ask more questions and, get a deeper understanding of where I'm coming from. But what most of us do is instead we say, I'm really upset. Well, I'm really upset that you were late because, you could have called me and I had other things to do and I'm a busy person, and next time could you please at least call me or send me a text message. So what I've done there when I do that is I tell him how I feel, but instead of giving him an opportunity to display to me that he's capable and willing to give me what I want in that moment, I fill in the gap. I tell him what I want or how it should be or how he should act, more to the point. And it not only takes away his opportunity to be that person, but it takes away my opportunity to receive that person. So hopefully this, I'm making sense. I know I'm rambling a little bit. I've been up since early, but vulnerability and receiving even is another massive one that we all know we need to do. And how do we do it? And this is part of it. We need to have the gap. So the gap is so important. We need to have the gap to be able to, being vulnerable is the gap, and having the gap puts us in a position to receive, but it also allows him an opportunity to give that which we want. So yeah, vulnerability, how to be vulnerable, it's different for everybody, but we need to have the gap. The gap is part of being vulnerable, and being vulnerable and having the gap allows us to receive, which allows him to be the man that he wants to be and that we want him to be as well. And remember, this works in all situations. This is simply that feminine and masculine polarity and dynamic. Hopefully that's made sense. And if not, ask me questions in the comments and I will respond.